Welcome, everyone. We're just getting warmed up here. People are coming into the room. Excited to see people from all over joining us already. That's great to see. I see the attendees still growing just a little bit, so I'm going to give it just a moment longer. For those who don't know, or this is your first time joining us, the Conceptual Foundations of Conflict project at USC is now in its second year. We're a group of faculty and graduate students who are interested in trying to identify, encourage, and promote philosophical work that helps us to understand the roots, the nature, the dynamics, and the consequences of interpersonal conflict, whether that's at the state level of war or politics or small scale interpersonal relationships. And we just feel like there's so much great work in many different areas of philosophy that's not always identified in that way that can help us to contribute to our understanding these really important conflicts that we deal with in our everyday lives. And this is the second in our public lecture series. We are very excited to have join us today Professor T. Nguyen, University of Utah, the recent awardee of the APA Article Prize for work on philosophy of games, who's here to tell us about games and gamification, what's good about one and perhaps terrible about the other. And without further ado, I'm going to let him take it away. He's going to talk for about an hour, and then we'll have time for questions.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. And I see some old friends in the participant list. I'm going to try to share my screen right now. Looking good?
Looks
How's
good.
that screen? Okay, awesome. So what I'm going to try to give you today is basically an overview of everything I've been thinking about for the last 7 years and everything I want to think about for the next 7 years. So this is going to be a bit of a wild ride. This is research that starts with stuff I was trying to do to understand the nature of games and moves into what I've been trying to think about now, which is how gamification and metrification is warping social systems. So the reason I think that I am here and then Mark wants me to talk is that one application of this stuff is thinking about what the gamification of Twitter is doing to public discourse and political discourse. But I think the picture might be even broader than that. So we start with two stories. So the first story is about, comes to me from my mother-in-law, Chris. So Chris said that she's retired. She was going on a vacation with her husband to Rome, and they were going to see old friends of theirs, friends that they'd never seen, they hadn't seen in about 10 years. And so Chris had planned this incredibly, she was super excited that they're going to be walking around Rome together, that they're going to be having dinners together, going to museums together. And she says the entire experience of that vacation was completely changed by her old friend's newfound relationship to their Fitbit. What she said was, she would plan a dinner and get reservations, and the friends would say something like, no, it's dinner time, but we can't come. We haven't met our step counts. We have to keep walking. Or Chris would say something like, oh, there's this museum I'm really excited to go to. And the friends would be like, well, museums don't get you enough step counts. So we're going to be out walking. You should go to the museum. We'll see you later. So thinking about this kind of thing, and I have to admit that I experience this kind of thing all the time. This isn't supposed to be a condemnation of other people. This is supposed to be about partially an autobiographical exercise about various forms of relationship to gamification and quantification that I think a lot of other people have experienced. I think what happened isn't like that this other couple made some kind of conscious decision that exercise and step count was more important than friendship or art. I think what happened is a little bit subtler. I think what happened is that there's no friend bit. There's no watch that tracks how many good social interactions you have. And there's no art bit that a watch that tracks like how many good aesthetic experiences you have in museums. But there is this thing, this Fitbit, and the Fitbit, by being so clear, so easy to use, and so pervasive, somehow swamps other considerations of value, just somehow becomes more prominent. So that's one kind of experience I want to talk about. Here's another. So about a week and a half ago, I went viral. And I'm on Twitter, as a lot of philosophers are, trying to do like serious stuff about like, politics and epistemology in the world. And then I tweeted this dumb tweet about a joke my kid made, and it went wildly viral. And it took over my weekend. Like I spent the weekend, I was like unable to tear myself from my phone. And I could feel something. There was an effect that I'd felt before, but I could feel it even more sharply now, which was my brain just kind of like was rewiring itself to find the next hit. It was like looking at thoughts I had and parsing through them and thinking like, will this be a good tweet? Will this be a viral tweet? Will this give you another explosion of endorphins like that? And so I have a worry, there's another version of the worry, that on Twitter, the creation of this clear, simple, metrified point system that's so vivid will shape our motivations and point them at exactly what's being measured by Twitter. So one way to put this is I'm worried that Twitter gamifies communications by providing points for discourse. But since its point system involves a specific embedded criteria, it's going to change our motivations and point them towards whatever criteria are being are embedded within its measure. That is, it's going to point our motivations towards popularity instead of connection or understanding. So in the background is a thought that's getting more and more common, and I think you can find it in Silicon Valley, you can find it in higher education and public education in general. Some people think like games are great, and so gamification is also great. So Jane McGonigal is a big gamification booster, and in her book Reality is Broken, she says something like this. Look, she's like, reality involves these horrible grinds, having to do these repetitive work things, having to like go through this miserable, boring stuff, but we have a technology, and that technology is designed to make people joyfully and intensely work hard at what we know to be incredibly boring tasks. We know that in a lot of like online role-playing games, grinding is boring, but people do it with such commitment because, as Jane McGonigal, that activity has been gamified. It's been given the structure. In World of Warcraft, for example, that activity has this particular game design element that adds points, scoring, and achievements. And so she says, if you lift these design elements off of games and put them into work, put them into public discourse, put them into education, then people will bring the same kind of motivational fervor into reality. Games, she thinks, can fix the basic brokenness of reality. So this entire talk is a very long-winded response to that thought. My thought is that gamifying things increases our motivation by simplifying the target. And simplifying the target is okay in games, but if you actually understand why it's okay in games and why it's great in games, you'll see why doing it outside of games is actually terrible, morally threatening, personally threatening, and socially threatening. Play involves fluidly stepping in and out of rule sets and frameworks of meaning and purpose. Play involves exploring one game rule system, exploring another rule system, stepping into one set of ideas. Gamification does not do that. It uses the same technology, but it typically creates an inflexible and pervasive and often inescapable set purpose for an activity. So what I would suggest is that gamification is the opposite of play. It's using the same framework and the same sticky ability to manipulate our motivations, but using it to very different ends. So I'm going to give you this talk in 2 acts. The first act is about why games are great and why games, real games, are fantastic, morally useful, and a form of art. And the second act is why, if you understand what makes games are great, you'll understand the problems with bringing those technologies outside of the secluded play environment of games and throwing them into work and education and public discourse. So first act, why games are great. So this line of research starts for me in an old question. the question, one way to put the question is what makes games an art form. What you see a lot of people talking about is trying to say, oh, games are actually great because they can tell stories or special kind of interactive cinema. A lot of people trying to defend games by comparing them to a familiar form of art that already has cultural respect and putting out the similarities between games and, say, narratives or movies. I think lurking under this question is another question. The reason I say I want to move away from this first question is, so I do philosophy of art, and I have to confess, if you spend a lot of time on the first question, then you have to spend a lot of time on this definitional question about what art is. And this is, to me, frankly, boring. And I think underneath what people are really asking when they're like, oh, are video games an art form, is this other question about whether games are a waste of time or meaningful and important. And now I'm going to suggest if you really understand what games are, you will understand why they have their own special place in a rich, full human and social existence. So my analysis comes out of work from a philosopher named Bernard Suits. So Bernard Suits in the 70s wrote this awesome book, now considered a minor cult classic, about what games were. It sold itself as an analysis of the term game, like a classically philosophical necessary and sufficient conditions analysis. But if you look at it, it's actually, I think, an analysis of the value of a particular kind of relationship to activity. It's about the value of play. So Suits' account, the short version, what he calls the portable version, is that games are unnecessary obstacles that we take up voluntarily for the sake of the activity of struggling to overcome them. Or what he means is like this. He says, look, think about a marathon. So you're trying to get to this particular finish line. But if you're trying to get to that finish line for the value of being in that spot, there are all kinds of incredibly efficient ways you could do that. You could take a taxi, call an Uber, right? You could take shortcuts, you do all kinds of stuff. But to run a marathon, what it is to run a marathon is to forbid yourself some of these efficiencies and take on particular constraints and obstacles that create this very particular form of struggling. Another way to put it, in my language, is that game designers manipulate goals, obstacles, constraints, and abilities, and they do that to create a particular experience of struggling, right? You don't run the marathon to get to the endpoint. You run the marathon because you're trying to overcome the obstacle of getting there under your own locomotive power. So he means games really broadly. He means sports and board games and card games, and surely he means video games. He didn't talk about them. I think as he was writing this book, like in the 70s, video games were just being invented in another part of the world. And I suspect he had like no understanding or awareness of them, but it is absolutely clear that Suits' analysis also applies to video games. Here's one way to put it. If you're trying to get to the endpoint of a video game, just the end screen, you could hack the code to get there. You could look up a walkthrough to get there. You could just look at a screenshot. What you're trying to do is do it under particular constraints in a particular way so that you can go through a particular struggle. So I think hiding in Suits' analysis is this really important understanding of the values that we can take in particular kinds of activity and a kind of value that's highlighted in a particular kind of play. So here is my suggestion on top of Suits' analysis. So I think there are two kinds of motivational states you can take towards gameplay. One is achievement play, and the other is striving play. So achievement play is playing a game for the sake of the value of winning, and striving play is playing a game for the sake of the engagement in the activity of the struggle. So achievement players play to win. Striving players, you can kind of imagine, take on a momentary interest in winning, and they get themselves to care about it, but they don't do it because they really care about winning. They do it because they care about having the struggle. One way to put it is it's in striving play. Striving play is something like the old saying that the journey is the destination. My way of putting it to myself in, stupid philosophical language is that in normal activity, we take the means for the sake of the ends, but in gaming activity, we take the ends for the sake of the means, right? We pick a goal for the kind of struggle that forces us through. I mean, I'm a rock climber, and when I try to get to the top of a cliff, I'm not doing it because I care about getting to the top, right? There's normally an easier way to get to the top. I do it because making myself want to get to the top gives me this really interesting physical struggle that I find valuable, beautiful, healthifying. I'm sorry, that's not a real word, healthifying, whatever. So yeah, striving play involves what we call a motivational inversion. So one thing that's interesting is when I talk about this stuff, some people, and by the way, I can't see anyone. This is a webinar format, so I'm just like staring at a blank screen, and I have no idea if you all are like, "Oh my God, this makes total sense," or "Oh, what a total idiot." So interestingly, when I give this talk, some people are like, "Of course, striving play, that makes sense. That makes total sense," and other people are like, "That's crazy. You're talking about a non-possible, weird manipulation of reasons and goals, and you're just making stuff up to justify the fact that you're just a competitive asshole." And I think Mark Schroeder just turned on his screen, and I feel like much less alone now. Thanks, Mark. Well, complaining sometimes works. Hey, everyone. Moral situation. Just complaining once in a while changes the situation slightly for the better. So one of the interesting things for me is, at least for philosophers, that one of the main places that suits has been taken up is in the philosophy of sport. And the philosophy of sport tends to concentrate on things like Olympic sports and professional sports. And many people in the philosophy of sports have a very achievement model. The point of doing sports is to be excellent, to win, to show your awesomeness and amazingness and your physical ability. But I think striving play is actually most evident in another part of the play world. I think we see it most often in home games, children's play, drinking games. We see it in silly games. And I think those are just as important to understand if you want a full picture of human agency and rationality. So here's one argument that striving play is real. Sometimes we limit our ability to win in the long term, even as we try all out to win in the short term. And what I mean is very simple. So my wife and I play a lot of board games. Some games she's much better than me. Some games I'm much better at than her. We have very different, like I'm the philosopher, so any kind of like legalistic close reading reasoning, like games like Magic the Gathering, I'm better at. She's a chemist, and anything that involves kind of geometrical manipulation, she destroys me at. But once in a while, we can find a game where we're perfectly even, and it's awesome, right? It's so cool. The struggles are so interesting. And then sometimes at night, when I can't sleep, I will find a strategy guide. And I'll be like, look, if I read the strategy guide, I'll just win all the time, because my wife would never read strategy guides. That's way too boring for her. If achievement play is the only reasonable kind of play, then there's only one reasonable action for me to take. Read the strategy guide, win all the time. But I don't, and I think it's totally reasonable, right? My reason for not reading the strategy guide is that the reason I want to play is to have this interesting struggle. And if I read the strategy guide, wins would be easy and the struggle would be uninteresting. So an interesting thing about the motivational structure of play is that we try to win in the short term, but a lot of the times we do things to suppress our ability to win in the long term, right? And I think that's because we know deep down that the win is not the main purpose. It's the local goal we take on for the sake of achieving a purpose. Here's another argument. This is my favorite thing I've ever come up with, and maybe ever will come up with. Here's another argument. Consider the category of stupid games. A stupid game is a game that's only fun if you're trying to win, but the fun part is failing. For example, Twister, the children's game of telephone. There's a game I love to play with a bunch of people. You can all play by, well, no, you can't play this because it's COVID, and I think it's terrible. When we're back in the normal life, you can play bag on your head. And the way you play bag on your head is everyone in the room puts a grocery bag on their head, a brown paper one, and you try to take it off of other people's head. And when the bag is taken off your head, you lose. You have to go to the side of the room. So, of course, first of all, the game is about stumbling, knocking into each other. It's hysterical. And at some point, there's one person left with a bag on their head, and everyone around the room is trying to keep quiet so the person doesn't figure out that they've won. Stupid games are only fun if you're trying to win, but the fun part is failure. And if you think about Twister, what's going on in Twister is you want to fail. It's funny if you fall and fail, but it's only a failure if you're actually trying to win. If you intentionally try to fail at Twister or telephone, it's not funny, right? It's the real attempt to succeed that makes it funny. So stupid games demonstrate the possibility of striving play. If striving play is possible, then we must have the capacity to absorb ourselves in temporary and disposable ends, to take them on for a moment and throw them away. I just want to mark this. This is going to be an important moment for the social critique, that we have this ability for someone to wave points in our face and us to say like, yeah, we'll do it, right? And I also want to mark that in real games, they're often disposable. You just care about those ends for a moment, and then you throw them away at the end. This is going to be the important part, because I don't think people do this with Twitter, right? So this helps us answer a question about what games are. What's the artistic medium of games? Like with oil, it's oil. With oil painting, it's oil. With watercolor, it's water and brush and paint. So what is it with games? Some people think rules, but rules can't be quite right because there's a lot of physicality in games, right? So this is rock climbing. This is bouldering. This is my sport, although I'm not as good as her. And much of the game, there are rules, but there's also the interaction with real physical stuff, right? So here's another example from the video game world. This is a lovely indie game called Pew 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 Pew, made for a game jam. And in Pew 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 Pew, there are two controls. One that fires this jetpack, so you go up, and if you're not firing it, you fall down. The other controls the laser to shoot obstacles. First thing, you control it together. One person controls the jetpack, the other controls the laser. Second thing, you don't control it with a button, you control it with a microphone. The person with the jetpack controls it by going, and the person that controls the laser goes pew, 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 pew to fire the laser. It's hysterical, it's funny, much depends on the microphone, how dry your mouth is, the ambience of the room, how much the crowd laughs with you, and how hard it is to make the noise physically when you're laughing in response to the crowd. So there's a huge amount of this game that isn't in the rules that emerges from the physicality of the game. So you might say, is it obstacles? And I think in part, but one thing to understand is that obstacles are obstacles only because you're trying to get to the other side of them. Another way to put it is Rainer Knizia, the great German board game designer, said that the scoring system is the most important part in a designer's toolkit because it creates the player's motivation in the game. Right? It tells the player what to want. It tells players whether they're trying to kill each other or help each other or cooperate to, end the pandemic. Sorry, that's not just a throwaway bad taste joke. The most popular cooperative board game is called Pandemic, and you try to control a pandemic. Haha. It tells you whether you're cooperating with these people against other people. It tells you what gives you points. So here's a way to put it. Playing games involves taking on temporary disposable ends, and the game designers set what those ends are. They set our motivation, right? So think about, I think, just the phenomenology of playing a board game. You take a board game, you put it out, and you have no idea what you're going to do, and you read the rules, and the rules tell you, try to collect as many gold pieces as possible. And you're like, okay, that's what I'm doing. And then at the end, you put it away again, right? So one way to put it is the game designer designates the values and goals of the in-game agent, the abilities of the in-game agent, and the environment that the in-game agent operates within. Here's one way to put it in a slogan. The game designer designs a practical agent and their practical environment, and you step into not just an environment, but a way of being an agent. Here's another way to put it. The game designer works in the medium of agency. There's the artistic medium. They design practical obstacles and practical abilities and goals. Here's another way to put it. Games are the art of agency, right? That's what the game designer manipulates. And striving play demonstrates our ability for agential fluidity. We can temporarily take on a specified goal and absorb ourselves in it and devote ourselves incredibly to it. And games highlight that we're really good at this. It's really easy when someone gives us points for us to just grab onto them. And if you can't tell where this is going, I think games use this ability for the good, and gamification uses this ability to undermine our autonomy and stick us in an alternate way of valuing that we can't get out of often, or that's very hard to get us out of. So why play games? I think there are a lot of reasons, but there's one important for the future of understanding gamification. So one of many reasons to play games is that real life is really fucking complicated and miserable, right? Like there are a billion values, they're hard to adjudicate. They're like, I'm supposed to be a parent now during COVID, and I'm supposed to make my child, raise my child well. What does that mean? Am I like, how much discipline am I supposed to do? How much self-control am I supposed to impose? What's their day supposed, like, what if they're happy and undisciplined? What do I do? How do I figure it out if I'm succeeding in this goal? I have no idea. And then I'm supposed to somehow balance that goal against the goals of teaching and work and research. And sorry, I'm not sure. I'm just making this up. This isn't really from my life or anything. This is just me. It's just totally fictional. Anyway, so it's nauseating, and it's nauseating because other people have totally different value systems, and I'm somehow supposed to blend all these billion opaque, Byzantine, subtle, conflicting, hard to commensurate value systems. But in games, for once in our lives, we know exactly what we're doing. We know exactly why we're there. And I think it's really interesting in most games, everyone else there is there for exactly the same purpose. We have clarity about our own values and the values of others and the application of those values. We know exactly how well we did, and we know exactly where we stand. I think they're a kind of balm against the pain of normal life. There are points. So here's a danger of games. One thing I'm worried about is that people might export an expectation of value clarity from games to outside games, and then be drawn to institutions and ways of thinking about those institutions that offer them some semblance of value clarity. They might be drawn to professions and actions that offer some kind of clear quantification. And so institutions that offer quantified senses of value might have an advantage in sucking in people that have this expectation. If you want it as a slogan, I'm not worried about games making serial killers. I'm worried about them making Wall Street bankers, right? I'm worried about the attitude of total instrumentalization of everything in pursuit of a single clearly defined goal that some external source has written into a rule set. So one last worry about games before we transition to talking about gamification. So you might think, what's the point of all these rules? Isn't this authoritarian and uncreative and unfree? And there's a long tradition of people in the philosophy of play talking about this. So Miguel Sicart, in this wonderful book, Play Matters, says that games are a bad form of play. He says that play is essentially free, and games try to structure play and destroy its essence. I think, actually, what I actually want to say is that gamification does what Sicart is worried about, but real games don't. And so I want to respond a little bit to Sicart here. So one response is that every medium of communication requires some norms and structures and rules to work for communication. So you might think various technological mediums let us record human experience. Fiction and movies let us record stories. Painting and photography let us record images. I think games let us record forms of agency. They let us write it down. And one thing you might note, all of these involve some kind of stable norms to make communication possible. It's easiest to see with something like a text. The norms are read the words and all the norms that have to do with how you interpret words and language. But even things like painting, there are all these norms that artists and audiences share for approaches to things in order to stabilize the experience. They're so common that we don't even think about them. For example, when you look at a painting, you look at it from the front. You don't lick the back or feel it while closing your eyes, right? There are norms for how we interact with any communicative medium that ensures that our interaction is similar. And I think that's what's happening with games. Those rules push us to have a similar experience. So my suggestion is that games offer us, using these norms, ways to communicate modes of agency. They form a library of agencies, and just like all the other libraries, they can help us become more free by teaching us more ways of being, by expanding our inventory of mental styles. When I started undergraduate, I was a crap philosopher in the analytic tradition, and one of the ways I learned how to do it was to play chess, right? Chess encodes this careful, techie, persnickety, tactical look ahead, which is required for the bread and butter of doing analytic philosophy. And I could find it in chess because it was so clearly specified. So here's a worry. It's a very abstract worry, but how could following rules ever make us more free? There are a few responses to this. One from people like John Elster is just the fact that binding ourselves with rules can be a way of extending our willpower, like making strict rules about trying to kick your cigarette habit or your coffee habit can be a way of making yourself more free. But I think there's something even deeper here, which is that unrestricted freedom often leads to us to repeat habitual frames of mind and ways of deciding, and that strict rules can temporarily push us out of our habits. This, I think, is a really familiar thought. This is how yoga works, right? If you let yourself move in your habitual way, you'll be stuck in certain patterns of motion. And the basic idea of yoga is through strict rules, you're forced to move out of your normal mode of movement into something new. And since these strict rules go through a sequence, right? Since you use these to explore many different postures, this creates flexibility in the long term. So here's another slogan. Games are yoga for your agency. They are, when played in large number and variety, a way of exploring different modes of agency and postures of valuing and different mental styles. Note, pause. That argument does not apply if you have a single pervasive system of points or rules that runs through the entirety of your life, right? That would be like trying to spend your life in triangle pose. By the way, I'll take this moment to have an advertisement. Everything I've said so far is in this book of mine that just came out. And everything that's coming after this is briefly discussed in a little section in chapter 9, but we're about to forge into new territory. So here are the key points going forward from my discussion about why games are great. Games manipulate agency through rules and points with our voluntary stepping into them. We like the experience of clear values. It makes things beautiful and crisp and clear and calming. This is safe in games because game ends are temporary and secluded from the ordinary world, right? And we can step away from them. And this builds freedom with games. We can try on lots of different agencies and lots of different games. So as Maria Lugones puts it, playfulness is about the ability not just to reject rules, but to move lightly between different rule worlds and between them. We are playful with games when we wear the rules and points lightly and we explore different ways of valuing and thinking. That ends the positive, happy portion of the talk. Okay. With that understood, I'm going to talk about why gamification is terrible. I just want to be clear, by the way, that I don't think every single instance of gamification is terrible, but I think that the way that it's instituted typically and the reasons for which it's typically instituted are terrible. So it'll be a sliding scale, but I think many of the major gamifications we see are terrible. So gamification is a process that builds game-like features like scoring systems and achievement into ordinary activities. So examples, Fitbit, Strava, Twitter, Facebook, a lot of places are gamifying workforces. Education is moving towards gamifying the classroom. So Jane McGonigal says gamification increases motivation by making dull activities fun. But I think with what we've seen from the first half, we can see that much of the pleasure of games and much of that motivational push comes from their ultra simplified values, which have been simplified in two ways. One, they've been simplified just in the sense that they're clear, and two, they've been simplified in a way that makes them mechanically applicable, that a device can just pick up and feed you a steady stream of points for. This creates value clarity. But to get that pleasure in ordinary activity, you need to simplify and narrow the goal of the real life activity. You need to transform it into something like a game. So one way to put it is McGonigal has this view that we can just use the technology of gamification and slap it onto an activity and add motivation. But the hidden presumption is that this doesn't change the nature of the activity otherwise and preserves the original goods of the activity. And I want to suggest to get those goods, you have to get the goods of gamification, you're going to lose typically a lot of the goods of other activities. So general theme, gamification increases motivation by simplifying the target. That's claim one. Okay, so example, case study in Twitter. Many of us come to Twitter, I think, with an interest in communication and connection and collaboration. And Twitter's scoring system aims us at virality, which is likes, retweets, and follower counts. And I think it should just be obvious that virality is easier to measure mechanically, but it's much thinner than these richer, harder to measure values like communication, connection, understanding. By the way, I want to be clear. My claim is not that Twitter is guaranteed to change your motivations. My claim is to the degree that you interact with Twitter as a game and get a motivational bonus from the point system, you have to align your value system to some degree with that point system, and then you get this effect. So one way to put the problem, games are appealing because their values are clear. To gamify ordinary life, we need to bring that clarity, and to do that, we need to change and simplify the target of the activity. And in particular, this isn't true of Twitter, but the more we gamify inescapable activities, the further we are from play. So Disney famously gamified their workforce. So for their hospitality workforce, was given without choice a ranking system, things that measured their speed, and then like lights that would flash whether they were going up the rankings or down. And everyone on the hospitality workforce said the same thing. They said they couldn't help it motivating them, and they hated it. They called it the electronic whip. They said they would skip bathroom breaks because they were so caught up by the game, but they also resented it. One of my worries is that when it's subtler, it does the same thing to us, but we don't even realize it, so we don't even resent it. But yeah, so the more it's tied to, and I know that there are a lot of educators in this room. I think the more you inflict an inescapable gamification on a educational requirement, right, the more you are the opposite of play, the more you are not enabling the light stepping into and out of differential value systems. But I think the problem is even problem. It's most obvious in the inescapable pervasive versions, but it's even clear when the activity is semi or completely voluntary, like Duolingo or Fitbit or Twitter. So that's what I want to talk about for the remainder of my time with you. So in games, I think changing the game goal is okay because game goals and game activities are secluded from ordinary life. But it should be really clear. By the way, this is not 100%. This is not true. This is typical, right? This is not true of like high stakes poker and things like that. But in many games, the goals and the activities are secluded from ordinary life. But it should be at least clear by this point that activities in Twitter are not secluded from ordinary life, and the large-scale gamification of people's motives for using that platform would maybe have an impact on the world. Okay, so here's a case study. This is from a paper of mine, How Twitter Gamifies Communication. So Twitter changes our goals for communication and public discourse in the direction of popularity. So here's a standard objection. But aren't the likes a decent proxy for a good communication? Like they're not perfect, but they're in the general direction. And what I want to point out is two things. They're not a decent proxy, and even if they were, they're a fixed proxy. And we're going to talk about the second part later. So let's talk about the first part. One of the reasons to think likes, retweets, and retweets are not a good proxy for communicative value is they capture positive first impressions, but not long-term impacts. So you're typically likely to hit like if you see the thing and agree with it. If it's like a really difficult thing and you don't like it at first, and then you have a long burn simmer about how good it is, and you realize it's great a week later, you're not going to click like. I actually tried once, and I couldn't even find the original tweet that made me think like that, right? So Twitter tends to capture positive first impressions, which is one kind of narrowing and shallowing. Another is it emphasizes the total number of likes rather than any deep or profound community connection. So this is an argument I'm actually borrowing from Matt Stroll. He has this Aesthetics for Birds post called Against Rotten Tomatoes. And this is what he says. He says, look, Rotten Tomatoes does something really, really pernicious, which is it turns this complex critical reaction into a binary and it aggregates the binary. So he says, look, great art is often divisive, right? Half the people love it, half the people hate it. They register really complex views. That shows up on Rotten Tomatoes as a 50%. The other hand, something that everyone thinks is kind of okay, pretty good, better than average, shows up, but everyone shows up as 99% on Rotten Tomatoes, right? Rotten Tomatoes gets rid of a lot of information. I want to keep track of this because we're going to come back to this later. Rotten Tomatoes gets rid of a lot of information and aggregates a very simplified measure. And so it elevates a very particular kind of work. Third value, it diminishes the plurality of values for which we communicate. Insofar as we come for different values and then get gamified, Twitter is going to point everyone towards popularity. Notice that popularity will have slightly different forms depending on your community, because different people will like different things, but still the impulse of getting as many likes as possible is going to be shared. And I suspect there's going to be a strongly flattening relationship to value across the system. And I think much of the problem is this. Gamifications work, as Jane McGonigal points out, by steadily trickling you points, right? You get to see them. In order to do that in a technological device, it needs to offer you points for something that's mechanically measurable. And right now, it's incredibly, we can't really measure connection, empathy, and understanding, but it's easy to measure short-term possibility. So the need to create a gamification system that quickly and reliably delivers you this trickle of points means that insofar as the gamification is effective, everyone using it will be pushed towards a value system which has been formulated around what can be easily and cheaply measured by a simple device. I just want to point out, by the way, there are enormous social goods to Twitter. I'm on Twitter. And you could have them all without the gamification. You could hear each other, you could retweet, you could connect, you could network. You could do that all if you just hit the scores, right? You don't need that. Although people will probably spend less time on the medium because it'd be less addictive, and so Twitter would make less money. But I just want to point out, Twitter structure as a network of communication doesn't need gamification, and it could be easily removed. That's the criticism of gamification. Okay, I have enough time. This is the big final push. I want to step back and get even more philosophical about what's going on in our relationship to scores and devices in the world. So I want to think about this thing. I've been thinking a lot about this phenomenon. It includes gamification, but it's a little bit larger because gamification is about the intentional use of game design attributes for the reason of increasing motivation. But there's something a little bigger I want to talk about. value capture. So value capture is the situation in which your values are rich and subtle, and you enter a social environment that presents you with simplified, typically quantified versions of those values, and then the simplified values take over in your reasoning, right? They start to dominate what you care about and how you make decisions. I think examples include academic assessment, research impact factors, retweet numbers, Facebook likes, numerical wine scoring, Fitbit numbers, quantified policing, BMI, and maybe, probably, money. So like, you go into journalism with a vast love of truth and you come out caring about clicks. You start exercising for your health, but you end up trying to max out your Fitbit numbers or optimizing your BMI. You start to learn out of curiosity, but you come out focused on grades. You start tweeting for the sake of truth, justice, and conversation and end up aiming largely at viral content. And for the philosophers in the room, you go to grad school out of a love of truth and wisdom, and you come out caring about citation rights, the status of your publications on some ranked list that somebody made, the status of your institution on some ranked list that somebody made, and your H-index. Not that this has happened to anyone, ever. So I just want to note, value capture is not the same as perverse incentives. Perverse incentives are familiar, but perverse incentives work by offering you some kind of instrumental incentive in relationship to one of these measures. I'm interested in the next step in which they get internalized as your core values, right? That's the thing I'm really worried about, and I think often happens. So there's a really rich literature in the background that I found really useful here. Interestingly, none of it's in philosophy. It's mostly in sociology, anthropology, and communication studies. I'm going to talk about some bits from it, but this is something I can recommend to everyone involved in any part of the educational system. This is Wendy Esplin and Michael Sauter's book, Engines of Anxiety. And Wendy Esplin in particular has been my hero in contemporary sociology of quantification. Her work is stunning, and this is kind of her opus. This is a 10-year study of what the US News and World Report law school rankings did to legal educational culture and legal culture. And they say, incredibly empirically sophisticated, rich study. And what they say is basically the US News and World Report rankings changed everything and made things worse. So one way they made things worse is before this, law schools had a wide variety of missions. And so some would have social justice missions, some would have corporate missions, some would have very theoretical missions, some would want to serve the community or underserved minority populations. And none of those all different missions are picked up by the rankings. The rankings largely care about incoming LSAT, incoming GPA, outgoing employment rate, right? So because everyone pays attention to the rankings, schools tend to plunge in funding and student choice when they drop in the rankings. And so schools have been forced to conform their targets to the US News and World Report. That's actually terrifying, but that's the less interesting thing for me because that's still basically a perverse incentive. But another thing they say is students have changed how they deliberate about law schools. What used to happen, and they actually have recordings and a documentation of this, is before the US News and World Report, students often would look at what law schools valued and then ask themselves what they valued out of a legal education. They would say, oh, I care about social justice work, or I care about, becoming a Supreme Court. And they would actually have to deliberate about why they are going to law school. So Esplin and Sauter say that since the law school rankings, and you can actually see most of this stuff on online forums, students have just stopped doing this. Deliberation has been cut out. They assume that their goal is to get into the best goal, where best is set by the US News and World Report rankings. So my way of translating this into philosophical language is that value capture disrupts the process of value self-determination. That we should be choosing our values for ourselves and tailoring them to our psychologies and our place in the world, but value capture cuts off that process and substitutes a prefabricated and standardized value for one that you've personally tailored. In a slogan, with value capture, you outsource the process of value self-determination. So I came to exercise late in life. I was very sedentary. And I thought I hated it. I was one of those people who was like, screw those stupid sports people. I have the life of the mind. Right. And I realized in my mid-20s that my body was breaking down and I had more back pain than my, dad, who's like 40 years older than me and is like a tennis player. And I started trying to find my way. And one of the things I quickly discovered was different exercises were incredibly different. So you could, like running had this Zen-like long distance thing and people would talk, but I didn't like that much. Ultra marathoning was like super grueling and intense, and I wasn't as interested in that. And I tried on the stuff. And then I found like rock climbing. And I think some of you may have this experience. If you're like a philosopher, rock climbing is like puzzles, right? It's like logic. And that's, so you can find in the world of exercise your own way through it, a way of valuing that resonates with you. And even when you pick an activity, there are lots of ways to pursue it, right? Some people pursue rock climbing for total physical intensity. Others look for the most beautiful climbs they can find. Others do it to have a sense of adventure in outdoor spaces. There are all kinds of ways to approach it. But if you're value captured by a Fitbit when you decide to become fit, then you outsource this process of deliberating and finding a value and activity that fits that value, and you leave it insofar as you're letting the Fitbit set your values to the technology and institutions behind it. By the way, I just want to be clear. I don't think the moment you strap on a Fitbit, it's all over. I think there are other ways to use it. But insofar as it becomes motivationally active, then you're outsourcing your values. So Fitbit embeds a way of evaluating the activity. And when you internalize it, you're adopting a prefabricated fixed mode of evaluation. By the way, some of this for the philosophers in the room is connected to a paper of mine called Trust as an Unquestioning Attitude. And what I'm really interested in is people have this view that we often extend our minds to technologies. But two things to say. One, most of the time people talk about extending pure processing power, like memory or like processing ability. But I think we can extend the mind to a system of valuing that's embedded in a technology. And second, I'm not sure if extending the mind is the right analogy here, because often we have the sense that when you bring something into yourself, you have control over it. But in this case, you're leaving a passage in your mind open to something that other people have control over and can tinker with the algorithms in. So I think outsourcing is a better, at least, image here. So here are two thoughts. Value capture damages our autonomy by taking the continued adjustment of our values out of our hand. And then it decreases, because it decreases the autonomy, it decreases the fit of those values to our own personal peculiarity by making the formulation of those values responsive, not to our own interests in psychology and way of being and experience and emotions, but rather to the interests of a large-scale institution. I just want to be clear here. One kind of interest could be that the institution wants to screw you and wants to control you, but another could just be the institution wants to make money, or the institution wants to, we're going to talk about this in a bit, wants to make you happy, but needs to do it in a way that it can measure, right? So institutional interests here are often about what works well in a bureaucracy. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So value capture substitutes for a live and adjustable value, a value that's narrow and that's inflexible because it's embedded in institutions and technologies. And here, I think this is, we're getting a glimpse of the big picture of my sense of the difference in games and gamification, right? In games, you dive in, you dive out, you dive in, you dive out. You experience a different value, a way of being, you experience a different one, and you get to step back and synthesize it of your own. Where in gamification and value capture, right, you're pegged to a long-term embedded metric that you have little control over. So once again, in order to be motivated by Fitbit and Twitter's gamifications or one of these other metrics, you have to care about those measures and internalize them. And unlike natural values, you're internalizing a score that's embedded in a technology and institution that's out of your control. So with our full rich values, you can reinterpret them, you can change them. And even if you use short-term proxies, this is really important. So even if you set short-term numerical targets for yourself, you can step back and be like, oh, is this proxy good? Is this proxy bad? But with value capture, you're taking in an inflexible specification of a value. That inflexibility is part of what makes it good. I mean, a Fitbit is good because it's so convenient on your wrist and keeps giving you points. For you to access that good, right, you have to tune yourself into the Fitbit. Similarly, Twitter not only gives you that value, but the value coherence of valuing the same thing in the same way with other people. And to get that good, you have to stay pegged on the values that are embedded in the technology. So it'll really help here to understand the background forces. So one question you could have about this stuff is that maybe this is the result of certain metrics, bad metrics, but maybe there are better metrics. And I want to show that no, this is not necessary for every metric, but an essential part of the basic role that metrics typically play in institutions. So we should expect this in most institutions. So to understand this, we should look at this really rich work on the history and sociology of quantification. That's just awesome and I think underread. So Theodore Porter in Trust in Numbers. So this is a landmark work in the history of quantification culture. He's a historian. By the way, if this, well, for those of you who do philosophy of science and science and technology studies, some of this will seem in a familiar flavor. And Porter is a historian who is profoundly influenced by Ian Hacking. And so Hacking's influence actually runs through a lot of the empirical work here. And so anyway, little philosophy historical side note. So Porter says, Porter's really interested in the difference between qualitative and quantitative knowledge. He doesn't think they're both bad. Sorry, he doesn't think either is bad. He thinks both have their role. He's particularly interested in the overuse of quantitative knowledge, especially in political and bureaucratic settings. So his account is that quantification trades nuance and sensitivity for portability and aggregability. He thinks there are some measures that are rich and subtle, but they require a large amount of shared background knowledge to understand. In order to get information that's usable in a large-scale bureaucracy between people with little shared background, you need to strip off the nuance and context in a standardized way to make the information readily transmissible and regularly aggregatable between people with little shared context. So here's an example. I love this example. It's like my favorite example. So there's a unit of measure called the hide, which we used to use, and but this, by the way, it's interesting because it's a measure, but it's a context-rich measure. The hide was a unit of land required to feed the average family. So it would vary incredibly. A hide by a river was small, a hide in a forest was medium, a hide in a plain was big. But to administer it, you needed to be basically at the local periphery, right? You can't administer it without having a rich sense of local ecosystems. They're hard to control from the center. So when you move to central control, you get movement to the acre, which is standardized, but is much, loses a lot of information. So James Scott puts it this way. Scott says that states, and by states he means corporations and governments, want the world legible in terms that are processable from a bureaucratic center. He says that states can only see the parts of the world that have been rendered into formats that are processable through their vast administrations. High-level administration needs information from all its various parts standardized and quantified so they can aggregate it, and then a CEO or someone at the top can bring the whole complexity into view, right? And it's also important to distinguish here between mere quantification and standardization. You could have, if every teacher came up with their own quantified grading system, that would be quantified but not standardized, right? You need similar criteria and a similar scale. Standardization regularizes the input rules. So consider for a second the GPA, since I think there are a lot of students in here. We could actually evaluate as teachers students in a piecemeal way tailored to their particular needs. I could respond one way to an interethics student who's interested not in writing, but in nursing and how that and how what I was teaching mattered for the practical life. I would teach a future law student a different way and a future academic a different way. There's no actual need for me to scale them against each other. The need to scale them against each other comes, State and Bowker and Starr suggest, from the need for large-scale institutions to quickly aggregate the data and make pronouncements about the effectiveness and make quick comparisons. You can put GPAs in a spreadsheet as an admissions officer and make it and just sort them and make a apparently objective cutoff. So gamification requires a steady trickle of points. In order to get those points to trickle, you need to be them based on something simple and easy to mechanically measure in mass. And so you have to align your values with something that meets Porter's standards for institutional usability, right? That's been narrowed and standardized. So another way to put it is when you formulate your own values, you get a lot of free play and you get a lot of response to inchoate and subtle emotions. But when you are value captured, you're accepting values that have been formulated for the interest of large-scale institutions, which could be malicious, but could also just be usable and aggregatable. One important thing I think in the background here, a lot of people look at the stuff and they say, oh, it's all capitalism, oh, it's all commodification. But if you look at at Scott's analysis, that analysis is an analysis of large-scale institutions. And I just want to point out, it's an analysis that covers both large-scale globalized capitalism and a centralized socialism or communism. P.S. For leftist progressives, I just want to say it's really important to me to distinguish carefully between the harms of capitalism and the harms of institutions, because I think if you do transition towards, you know, a more leftist state, you'll lose one, but you're not going to lose the other. You might think the other might get even worse. So it's something to keep in mind. So what you get for, here's what you get for aligning yourself with such a measure. You get the experience of clear values for yourself and the experience of value alignment and value harmony with everyone else. You get total coherence and easy explicability across the system. What you give up is tailoring your values and controlling your values. So gamification offers motivation, but here's one image. It offers a prefabricated piece of willpower that gives you that motivation only when you accept the target that's in the factory settings. So here's another slogan. Values should be individually tailored, but in value capture, you get your values off the rack. Actually, it's even worse than this, because if you buy your clothes off the rack, you could still tailor them, right? For these to work in the way they're working, they can't be tailored. So one objection. So I also want to say, look, when we just, don't we decide in some sense to put on the Fitbit each day? Like, can't you just drop out of value capture at some moment? Here's one response. Because the decision is habitual and so prepackaged, it gets easier, and so you're not really reflecting. That's encouraged by the technology. But I think there's even a deeper response, and that worry is that the decision is binary. And here's my best shot at explaining what I'm worried about. The problem is one of granularity. Instead of adjusting your particular parts of a value, you either accept the whole package or you don't. So the level of autonomy you have in value capture is like the control you have over the contents of an end user license agreement. You did technically sign it, and you're responsible, and it's a minimal sense autonomous, but your control over the details is minimized. So here's my suggestion. Value capture doesn't entirely remove your autonomy, but it puts you in the same relationship of autonomy and control over your values as you have over your iPhone's EULA. And maybe, if you're like me, you will find that worrisome. So, big picture, games are pleasurable because they narrow values temporarily. They're safe because those in-game goals are detached from the real world. And they're good for moral development because they show us different ways of being agent when we're fluid and we treat them like a form of yoga for the mind. Gamification is pleasurable, but it narrows values in the real world. It's not safe because it changes those values in the real world. And it's not freeing because insofar it's pervasive and it sucks you into an embedded system, it leaves you stuck in a factory set value. That should be the end of the talk if I were fully sane, but I'm just going to give you a couple more minutes of something a little more unhinged. We're almost to the end. Here's a big thought. You may find this appealing, you may find this paranoid. So for Scott, large-scale states can only see and manage the parts of the world that are legible to them, right? That are put in quantified, standardized ways that can be sucked into the administrative processes. So Scott says, and this is the centerpiece of his book, that states have a further motive to remake the world into terms that are legible to them. So there's examples of the gratification of cities, the simplification of land ownership laws, forests. He says, once land ownership laws used to be incredibly complicated, like this, you would have like strange, terraced, like cascading water rights, animal rights, it would be this, but since those were so variable from one place to another, centralized governments couldn't handle them, so they enforced this simple one person or entity owns all of one land rule. Scott talks about the transformation of the German forest and the rise of scientific agriculture. He says that one of the things that happened was because the original diversity was so hard to measure, this is kind of a brute and stark example, but forest managers reduced the diversity of the forest from about 100 species of trees to 2 and removed all the underbrush and replanted the trees in regular lines because they were easier to manage and monitor that way, and optimized for a single number, which is plank yield. It's a really interesting part of the book. So here's my extension to Scott. Scott is talking about actions. My suggestion is, if our values are subtle and hard to understand and variable and privately negotiated, they're illegible to the state. The states would, the state, and again, this means corporations or any kind of large-scale institution, would vastly prefer that we gamify, that we reorder our values along lines that are ready-made for institutional comprehension, which suggests a further explanation for value capture. Value capture renders our interests legible to large-scale states. Scott, in one of my favorite parts of seeing like a state, talks about the difference between polycropping and monocropping. So polycropping is growing a lot of plants in the same space where the functions overlap, like large trees shade things, bushes send out roots that block erosion, little plants that live in those roots put nitrogen back in the soil. It's really productive, but it requires incredible fine-tuning of the local environment. It requires a highly autonomous farmer. Those decisions are non-standardized and incredibly hard to control from the center. So large-scale institutions typically prefer monocropping, which is large organized fields of single crops on soil that's been refertilized to be standardized so that it can match the single the environment of agricultural science, right? That's very legible to the state. So if you buy Scott, then my suggestion is the existence of value capture is unsurprising. Coming up with their own values, coming up with their own tastes, coming up with their own aesthetic and moral sensitivities and interests is like polycropping, right? It's this vast and unmanageable landscape of differently autonomous people that are illegible from a large scale. Institutions have an interest in managing the world, have an interest in managing our values and our values and interests. So we should expect them to use tools like gamification and value capture to get our individual values to align in forms that are legible to the institution. Individual values are the last frontier for legibility. Thank you.
Wow, that was fantastic. I feel really good about my promise that this is going to be awesome. So what we're going to do is we've got more time for questions. I'm going to start with a question from David Spurritt and others who use the hand raise function. When I get to you, I'm just going to raise you so you're able to speak up and you can ask your question yourself. And if you want to clap in the chat, we're getting a little bit of the chat going. All right, so David, go ahead. Sorry, I lied. Now, David, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Mark, and thanks very much, T. I really enjoyed that a great deal, and in fact, my question turned out to be kind of right in the middle of what you described as the unhinged ending. So, what I want to ask is, don't you think, or here's a suggestion, don't you think that at some level a person's autonomy would have to have been compromised already for this gamification to be tempting? And partly I was thinking there, having recently read something I know you've read, and that's Natasha Schull's book about machine gambling, and she talks a great deal there about how both the addicts and the casinos and the therapeutic interventions have bought into this idea of the entrepreneurial self, right? People already agree that they're engaged in an enterprise of trying to get return on investment for the time in their life, literally the time of their life. And so do you think something like that, or do you think that any human, any culture, any age would have been vulnerable to gamification?
Right. So I think my views here have evolved a bit. I used to be on the side of, look, this is the intrusion of metrics is all terrible. There's the destruction of autonomy. And now I've been thinking something slightly different. So what I think now is something like, there are some goods that are best pursued at a large scale collectively. And the larger the scale, the more we do need something like a simple metric. So you might think climate change, right? Controlling the pandemic. There's a simple good that we do share, and for us to pursue it collectively in an organized way, we need something like a clear, simple value. My worry now is about, I think one way to put it is, my worry is that different values are going to be kinds of values are functional at different scale. So I just have a new draft of this stuff, and the term that I'm floating now is value federalism, that there are reasons exactly like with political states to devolve control to, like, some things you need a huge federal thing for, some things you need little communities for. And there are kinds of values that are really good for people to formulate on their own, and there are kind of values where it'd actually be really good if we had this large scale and people kind of cohered. So I think actually, I don't want to say that, oh, it's a flaw in autonomy. It's more like there's this essential tension between individual life and social collective life. And we're the kind of people that want to live both, right? But then the suction to go all social is incredibly strong. So I think there's a breach here that opens us up for this, but that breach comes from our basically social nature and the goods associated with large-scale collective action, which are really good, but are not the only thing.
Fantastic. Rachel, Keith.
Hi. So my question is about what to do given this information you've provided us. So is a smaller scale gamification a good thing given larger scale gamification? So I'm thinking about in a classroom, if you're trying to prepare your students to succeed in academia writ large, given the value capture as you described it in academia writ large, is it better to include some sort of value captured way of measuring success in the classroom, or yeah, so is it better to play within the system until we can change the larger system, or are there still net benefits to de-gamification on a smaller scale?
Right.
Yeah, I think I made my point.
Oh my God, this is like the hardest question. First of all, I should say I don't know what, on some deep level, like I feel like I might spend the rest of my life trying to describe the problem and I have no idea how to fix it. One thing to think is, insofar as it's a problem, part of the problem is pervasiveness, right? Like, I mean, one thing I often think is, one of the things that makes GPA so value capture for students is that it's the front leading measure that shows up everywhere, from evaluating institutions, evaluating students, evaluating classes. And if you wanted to discourage the gamification of education, then you want to decrease the pervasiveness of GPA. However that could be done. But of course, like, I mean, the worry, of course, I mean, in some way, the worry I hear from you is like, the world is terrible, but shouldn't we be preparing our students for the particular way the world is terrible? And I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. But I do think there's some, I think one response you could have is to inculcate in students the ability to play the gamification game, but try to block the total unthinking absorption of external metrics. And the way to do that would not be to hit them with one persuasive incentive system that went through the whole education of the whole classroom. It would be, I mean, in some sense, I do think that there are certain ways in which playing games in the right spirit is the antidote to gamification, at least in the sense that it inculcates the spirit of both fluidity, the practice of fluidity, and the spirit of stepping back from game systems. So, I mean, I think if you want to prepare your students, you have to prepare them to know how to hit game-like targets, but that doesn't necessarily mean preparing them by fully inculcating them into game-like systems as completely taking over their souls. But if you ask me how to do that, I don't know yet. I don't know. I wish I did.
Colin Colson.
Hi.
Oh. Sorry, Colin.
Okay, here. First of all, I just wanted to say that was an amazing talk. My mind was blown a lot. And I just wanted to ask you about, I mean, we talk a lot about like how social media is affecting the children, but that made me think about like, I mean, just how is it affecting their values? I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Right. So, by the way, one thing I want to point out, a lot of people want to say something like, oh, social media is this new thing that's destroying everything. We've never had anything like this before. And if you buy the story I have, I think this is an effect that's as old as bureaucracy and large-scale institution. Technology is making it more available, but we shouldn't think this is like a new thing. So the suggestion is, my suggestion is the way that it's changing what people value. And I mean, it's funny, like, I think you said like the children, but as a matter of fact, like a lot of the users on Twitter are like, you know, middle-aged journalists who are just as value captured, right? Or I'm not gonna even talk about political use of Twitter right now. So the change is in the change of whatever is measured by the system, and the change is towards popularity or virality. So that's my suggestion. That it's kind of let me try a side. Let me try a side analogy. Maybe this is nuts, but I think Instagram has been screwing with food culture. And the way that Instagram is screwing with food culture is because what does well on restaurants whose fate is tied to their Instagrammability are motivated to make food that pops on Instagram, which is different from food that is delicious to eat, right? I mean, actually, I've started noticing there was a kind of donut shop and pastry shop that gets really popular, and they have a kind of structural amazingness and vivid color, but to get that, the textures are often really waxy and too hard to eat. And I think they're sacrificing edibility for Instagrammability, right? So as long as there's some gap between what you might have valued and this other thing, then I think the value capture will shovel everyone onto the side of the gap of what's measured. And again, what's measured is popularity. And that's a very different and very simple value.
Thank you. That's really good.
Micah Magnani.
Hi, Michael.
Great. Hey, so I was wondering if you could say a bit more about, okay, I don't know if I endorse the thought behind this question, but I think a lot about it. So people talk about how we're cognitively very limited. We only have so much energy to reflect on our values, and we have information and stuff coming at us all the time. So there might be the reason to argue that like part of autonomy requires being able to rely on these off the rack values sometime, because we only have so much energy to sit and reflect on our values and to reconsider them, renegotiate them. And I feel like you've suggested that before, maybe in other talks, maybe a little bit in this talk. And I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about this kind of cognitive limitations we have and how there might actually be a role for us to rely on these pre-made values.
Right. So here's some suggestions. One, as a cognitively limited being who needs to use heuristics, I think we rarely do live in the light of our full values. But one thing you can do if you have heuristics and you have control over them is you can use a heuristic for a while, and then you can step back and ask yourself how you're doing in light of your fuller and larger values. So you are using a proxy. So my thing about this is the way it looks is, okay, when I tried to exercise for a while, I tried to run 5Ks, right? There's a simple target. And then I stepped back after a while and was like, I'm not enjoying this very much, right? So the fact that the proxy is under my control makes it mine. And the worry is that the embeddedness of proxies, insofar as you're fully value captured by them, there are very strong incentives not to distance yourself from the proxy. So that's one thought. Another thought I have is just, yes, we do outsource some forms of value, but notice the kind that I think it's comfortable to outsource. So here's some things, some kinds of value that I've outsourced. I think I've outsourced my dishwasher values, right? I just buy what Consumer Reports tells me to buy about what's a good dishwasher. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. And I think that seems plausible for a few reasons. One, I mean, we do have to outsource some stuff, but I think it's one thing that when you outsource something, you're saying literally, I don't care about the content of this value enough to fiddle with it. So do it where it doesn't count, right? And then think about it where it counts. That's one thought. Another thought is, I think there are some realms, and this is a little dangerous. There are some realms where the value is simple and shared, like the dishwasher values, or the value of, or the value, right? Sorry, or like large scale health values, right? You might think. Then the value is simple, and so those are the ones that are right for value capture. The values that have the most relationship to complexities of emotional experience and personal peculiarity are the ones that it seems that we lose the most for outsourcing. So that's why a lot of these examples I give are things like fitness, your education, your job, your purpose in your career, your aesthetic life. Although the thing I still worry about this, because in the background, one of my worries is it's easy to think an activity is simple and has a common value if you haven't spent a lot of time and attention on it. And so there might be a loop. So I'm often worried about these things, especially in aesthetic life. We have these loops where if you don't pay enough attention to something, you won't see that it's valuable, and you won't see that there's any attention that you should be spending on it. And one of the worries is it's easy to push things into this role of like, oh, I should be outsourcing that. It's not that important. And that's because I haven't realized how important it could be. And maybe that's, I think, a lot of people's relationship with fitness. Like if you were like me at age 20, you'd be like, this is stupid. There's nothing there. Let me just do this other thing.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, does that help at all?
Yeah, no, it's very illuminating. Thanks.
Laura Nicolara.
Hi, yeah, thanks a lot for this talk. So I have a question about how really sort of real value directed this whole like Twitter engagement might be. So here's what I mean by this. So I take you to be saying that what's bad about implementing measurements and gamifying things is that it misrepresents a value. So like you want to be fit and you end up with this idea that to be fit just is to walk 10K steps a day or whatever.
Yeah.
And similarly, you might say that you have all these metrics on Twitter and stuff, and you might end up thinking what it is to be good at debating or good at defending a position is to have enough likes and enough engagement. But one thing that I see a lot on Twitter is that people engage in super simplified discourse, exchange slogans. Sometimes they're just mean to each other, make jokes and stuff. So this is like very low level intellectual debate. And the thing is, I see people who aren't like that in real life. Like they do not speak like this when they are in the philosophy room, say. And that makes me think about, it seems like there's an extent to which this whole like playing the game on Twitter just is a kind of self-contained thing with its own rules that might not necessarily like people can actually play it while really thinking this is just its own thing. So I was wondering what you make of that, and whether that really is treating it like a game in the way you describe games. So I was thinking, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think it's really it's going to be I'm telling this story like it's a big, huge sweep, but the individual technologies and systems are so variable in the relationship. So I think it is. So first of all, I think there's an interesting difference between Fitbit and Twitter, which is that you might think that Fitbit exudes itself more into ordinary life more, where Twitter seems like a more separated environment, right? Like in Fitbit, you're always walking. So you always kind of negotiate any fitness activity in those terms, where Twitter, you have different conversational modes. So there are a few things to say about the Twitter case. The first thing is, even if people are successfully confining themselves to using that motive only on Twitter, which I think is true of a lot of people, insofar as Twitter is, a central domain of public discourse, then everybody who's on it and influencing the world is responding in that way. You might also think a similar thing happens with journalists and clickbait. The other is, I think it's going to be very variable. So the gamification thing is not, again, it's not like the technology just does it. But I think, and this is actually something that's empirically studyable that no one, as far as I know, has, and I would love for people to do it. I think some people get on Twitter and it doesn't motivate them at all. Some people get on Twitter and it motivates them just on Twitter. And other people, I find myself sorting my thoughts outside of Twitter for what would make a good tweet. I think Mark is nodding. Mark is also on Twitter. And that's not quite the same as getting Twittery everywhere, but it's there. So the thing, here's another way to put it. This is actually an empirical question that I'd be really interested in someone pursuing, which is what is the leak of the game-like attitude of pursuing points to contexts that haven't been sharply gamified in that way. The last thing to say is, I think that confinement on Twitter might be one of the reasons why Twitter is actually one of the less dangerous examples. And you might think, for example, that like citation rates and school and publication rankings are much more pervasive for academics. And it seems more plausible that an academic might spend their entire life thinking that way. And I think I have a lot of anecdotal evidence that many academics do transform their entire research lives in terms of getting published in the fanciest place. So it's going to vary a lot, but I think it is really important to remember that some of these things can be confined even if that's not fully safe.
Thank you.
Samuel Deshaw.
Thanks for this talk. I mean, this is really interesting. I guess it's a question about trying to gauge your optimism about making games within gamified environments. So I'll just start with this sort of case. So I know some DJs who put tracks on YouTube, and if it gets views, that's great, but more than 1,000, that's bad, because then it's not on the ground anymore. So they've sort of, I think, it tailored a sort of off the rack scoring system. And so I'm just wondering whether you have any sort of optimism about generalizing this strategy to other gamified environments.
That's an awesome example. Sometimes I think, I know people who are like, well, you don't want to be too popular in philosophy because that means you're doing shallow work, something like that, right? So I think that's a good way of using, that's a way that partially takes control of the proxy. But I think also, this stuff is on a spectrum, but like even then, the basic thing being measured that you're playing with is something that you don't have control over, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you can put a meta rule on top of it about how those scores count, but you can't reformulate the score. It's still fixed on one thing, right? And so that's going to be in between. But again, like I also have to say that there's no way that we can I don't think we're going to be able to leap out of a world with metrics in it. In fact, I think, insofar as you think that we need to be, as long as you're not an anarchist. By the way, James Scott is an anarchist, though I always have to note he is the kind of anarchist that kept a lifelong tenured position at Yale. So I think that I always want to read his anarchism in that light, and the anarchism of a lot of philosophy professor anarchists in that light. But insofar as you think that we are going to be in institutional living, and institutions of bureaucracies require metrics, we need to figure out how to live with them. And maybe this is the kind of solution that is part of this compromise state we can find to live within these large-scale institutions. It's a great example.
Cool, thanks.
I've got 3 more questions. I think we'll get through before the 90 minutes, but if he is willing, we might continue after that a little bit longer.
That's right.
So Ellie Neufeld next.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for this really interesting talk. Yeah, as others have found really interesting, but I'm also really confused now, and I want you to help me out of my confusion. So the thing I'm kind of not understanding is why value capture is kind of incompatible with self-determination, because I kind of thought, especially towards the beginning of your talk, that value capture kind of happens in almost everything we're doing. Like when I'm reading a book, I'm like kind of semi or pseudo value capturing myself, as in like, I want to get to the end, but of course the end isn't like the real goal for me, but like the journey is the goal, the kind of pleasure and the values I get out of the book as I'm reading it. Or grad school, like I'm like, oh, I care about getting a job, but of course the cool thing about grad school happens in between. Or like same with real games, as you said in all your examples, like if I play something, I'm like, oh, I care about winning at the end or something like that. Or with the rock climbing, I care about getting to the hill, but of course all the cool stuff happens as you're climbing. So the hill doesn't really seem to value capture the climbing in a way that takes away the self-determination aspect of the climbing. Like as I'm climbing, I'm still like, oh, this is cool about climbing, and that is cool, and the adrenaline, and so on and so forth, because you kind of start to value other things along the way. So I'm just kind of wondering why the same can't happen with the Fitbit and so on. So I'm kind of pretending that I'm value capturing myself for a while, that like, oh, the step count is what really matters to me. But along the way of achieving the step count, I start to see all the other all the other things that are cool about walking. Like, oh, it's so pleasurable and makes me come to peace with myself and whatever. Yeah, so I'm confused about that.
Okay, so basically, I think there's a large difference between our relationship to games and the relationship we're trying to describe in value capture, and the positive version you're describing of a relationship to Fitbit looks to me more like a game-like use than a value capture use. And remember, I mean, in the background, it's not, I mean, a lot of this is about what our relationship is to the technology, and we can have different relationships. You can definitely use Fitbit as a game. My worry is that certain features of technology encourage the long-term value capture rather than the game-like relationship. So to spell it out a little more clearly, the definition of value capture I offered occurs when an external value begins to dominate your reasoning in an extended fashion. So if it dominates it in a short-term fashion, if you let it dominate, then you can also pull back at any moment. That doesn't count as value capture. That's the kind of game-like temporary absorption in an end,
Oh
which
yeah,
you can use to
okay, I
explore
see.
all kinds of stuff. So value capture occurs when, to put it simply, you play a game, you take on the value of winning, and then you step back and you ask, was that activity valuable for me in terms of my rich sense of life? In that case, it's only a temporary absorption, and you have proxy control. You have control over those temporary proxies. It's when somehow that process of stepping back gets subverted, you stop, or you're tempted to stop doing it, and the discussion of value capture is supposed to give some explanation of the kind of psychological mechanisms that where you get something out of aligning yourself with these values and then not asking any questions. So
if we were to use all these things only as games,
Yeah.
then it would be fine.
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think they make it real that features such as pervasiveness and alignment with others tempt us to not treat it as a game.
Yeah, I see. Thanks.
AG Holdier.
Hi, thank you for the talk, Dr. Nguyen.
What's up, AG?
I'm curious about, I was going to ask you to talk about something with the political implications here, but I think that would probably take more than the 3 or 4 minutes we have left. So I'm curious instead about the possibility of people playing a game differently than their fellow players. So in the case of Twitter, this might look like people dunking and retweeting on people, ostensibly, playing into the metrics, but subverting them, signaling different values. I'm curious how that fits into the value capture model.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So first, in the background, I think I've always suggested that we should be careful, just about games, we should be careful to distinguish between the software environment and the game you play. And often different people can play different games in the same software environment. So one example is speedrunning versus traditional games. Another example is, as people have often charted, in World of Warcraft, some people play it to get as many points for themselves. Some people play it to get as many points for their guild. Some people play it to get social stuff, right? And the game actually supports this by, an interesting thing about World of Warcraft and a lot of games in this space is there are a few different metrics in the game that measure slightly different things. You can choose, I'm going to care about my own experience points. I'm going to care about the rankings of my guild or something like that, right? By the way, I may be using the wrong terms. I've never played World of Warcraft because I know myself well enough to know it would destroy my life completely because that's the kind of game I played as a kid. Okay. So about Twitter, an interesting thing about Twitter is, again, this sounds like this thing where you can modify this example about hit YouTube likes, but not over 1,000. And an interesting thing about Twitter is maybe you might say that, well, in some sense it's the same game, but people are playing a very different activity. So if one person is, their entire Twitter following is like, let's say that they're to use centrist journalist and their political following is moderates, and another person is like a radical leftist and their following, they're going to get rewarded for different kinds of activities, right? But still, insofar as you're using the point system, you have to filter all of these differential community values through the same minimizing filter, which is the filter of likes and retweets. So it's just I mean, the image I almost have is people come in with different values and the communities have different values and they all get like processed in this through the same kind of sausage maker. This is my cranking the sausage zoom gesture. Does that make any headway on the question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's definitely something that I'll keep thinking about. Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to take this moment to thank T and thank all of you for joining us for this session. This our second public lecture as part of the Conceptual Foundations of Conflict project. If T's willing, we've got at least 3 more questions coming up, and I can continue as long as people have stuff to ask and T's willing to take them.
I can take those questions.
Awesome. And of course, I understand that I advertise for 90 minutes as people trickle out.
Yeah.
But Kaylee, the show.
Hi, T. Thank you so much for the talk. That was so interesting. I was just curious because, there are a lot of kids that are growing up in this culture of like winning and like playing sports and like being very competitive and educational and all these different endeavors. How do you imagine there being a kind of diverge between determining a game versus something that's becoming more of a value capture to prevent these kids from having this kind of value of importance of these metrics kind of overriding their individual development of values?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the answer for me again is pervasiveness and inflexibility. I mean, one thing in the background, I'm really influenced here by Martha Nussbaum's account of the value of literature. I mean, Nussbaum thinks that different literary works encode different emotional experiences of the world, and the value again comes from temporarily being enmeshed in someone's different value perspective and then coming out of it and then reading like 1,000 books and seeing all these different emotional perspectives and then making them available to you and being able to synthesize what you've learned from them, which is different from like taking one book as this is my emotional perspective forever. And I think basically something similar with relationship to games. I think like the playful attitude towards games is one of going in, going out, considering it from the outside, and then maybe getting that as one piece of the inventory. It induces, I think, a reflective state. I mean, games are narrow experiences of pursuing points, but if you step back from them, then you get both this narrow perspective and this larger overlook of the value of that perspective in a larger context. And I don't think the worry about value capture is you don't get that. Like it's when you don't step back and be like, why am I doing step count? Why am I chasing citation rates? You just go for that all the time. So a lot of it's about one of the standard ideas about play is that play is temporary and secluded and it offers a transition in and out. And the suggestion is real play with games has this positive effect, but gamification is built to avoid that transitioning, fluid, explorative mode of play.
Great. Jen Foster.
Cool. Hi. Hi.
Hello.
Okay, so thank you so much for the talk. And also thank you for sticking around to talk to us who are still left in the queue. So I have 2 questions that even still are a little inchoate and actually are coming from like 2 different directions. So I don't really think are like ultimately coherent with one another, but I just sort of wanted to push back on the 2 different places and just see what you said. So the first goes back to something that AG I think was pushing on is like flexibility even within what might seem like narrowly circumscribed games. Mm-hmm. So my partner and I play a lot of games, especially in quarantine. And recently we've been playing games like Terraforming Mars and Race to the Galaxy. 7 Wonders was like the thing we were obsessed with like a year ago or 10 months ago. And we kind of have gotten past that, but they all have something in common, which is that you sort of like build a tableau. Yeah. And I mean, ultimately there are like winning and losing conditions of those games. And it's not like World of Warcraft in the sense that, I mean, I also, full disclosure, have not played World of Warcraft, but I understand the concept of being rewarded on different dimensions, and these games just don't do that. I mean, like you just ultimately want victory points, or at least that I take it is what the presupposed idea of is. But one thing that my partner and I kind of consistently get into conflict about, like minor conflict, when playing these games, is that he really is like taking this like idea of needing to, you know, wanting to get the max number of like VPs that he can and to like beat me like seriously. So he tries like at every point to do the thing that's going to maximize his points. Whereas I just like to build the tableau. And I like to just like break the rules and like do more rounds just so I can have like more in my tableau because I like the building part. It's like, so I guess the reason I'm asking this is just, I kind of wanted to raise at least some skepticism about even the sort of like foundational assumption that within some of these game frameworks that there's a flattening of values. Because it seems like, you know, there's definitely like a circumscription of what is taken to be like the default or something. But like, it just definitely seems like there's room to come into conflict, even like within that circumscription. For example, like how fast you should get to the end, or you know what you should do on the way there. Okay.
Wait, is that the first question?
Yeah, you can respond to that.
Yeah, let me respond to that before you break my brain. First, the most important thing for me to say here, before anything else, is that you should play the game Res Arcana.
Oh, I forgot to mention Res. That's the other thing we've gotten super into.
Oh my, we just played. Okay, anyway, awesome. So one thing to be clear, I mean, sorry, the opening presentation was rushing like a book and a half worth of material, but the kind of hyper-absorbed flattening of value is only one way to play games. There are all kinds of other relationships you can have. And I just think that my worry is specifically that particular attitude, which is enabled by games, is problematic when it's enabled elsewhere, but it's definitely not the only way we can play. And let me just give you an example. I think one of the interesting things to me about tabletop role-playing games is in many groups, some groups play with the point is to max out experience points, and other groups play with this kind of like, oh, the point of this kind of loose background suggestion that we dip into and out of, but mostly we're just trying to invent a fun narrative, right? I think both are available methods. One interesting thing is I think some games, this is a known thing in game design world. Some games are such that if everyone, they only work well if everyone is chasing victory points really hard. And if someone doesn't, it kind of breaks the game and makes the game unplayable to other people. And other games are designed very explicitly, especially in the German family Eurogaming world, are very explicitly designed so some people can play for victory points and some people can play for aesthetic reasons or social reasons, and that their actions don't break the play of the others. I actually think Terraforming Mars is a really good example of one in which different modes of play are available, and I think a lot of the times the tableau building games have that. So again, the claim isn't that's the only way of interacting with games, and it's certainly not the only way of interacting with gamified technologies. You can definitely ironize them or play around them with other reasons, but it's that it's an available mode that we know how to do, and when gamifications try to push us towards those modes and we take up that hyper-absorbed mode, then this is worrying. But it's not like this is the only possible mode.
Okay, that's super helpful. Can I just take a couple more minutes to ask the second half? Okay, that actually helps come into this one. So then I am sort of wondering, and I think this was along the lines of Ellie's question, how tightly tied this is to games at all. So, I mean, one thing that that resonated with me about what you said was the idea of like sorting your thoughts into what would be a good tweet. I understand this phenomenon, but I also understand the phenomenon of being in class and thinking about like, what's sorting my thoughts into what would be a good joke that would make my students laugh. You know, being in a Q&A and sorting my thoughts into like what questions would be, you know, ones that like people think are, you know, make me seem smart. And that's like, it's just part of everyday normal social interactions of sorting based on what you think the response is going to be. And yeah, I feel, I mean, when I'm on Twitter, it feels to me anyway, like anecdotally, a lot like that. It's not really clear to me that it is like different in kind.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to raise that.
So one thing I should say is the relationship between games and the value capture stuff, for me, is partially autobiographical because it comes up. I figured out certain thoughts by thinking about games, and two, it's separable. Like I think you can understand and think about the value capture stuff separately from games. It's just interesting to me that there's a standard view that games are good, so gamification must be good, and that's one of the things I wanted to pose. Background. That's not really what you're asking about. So I think we often, I mean, again, it's this embeddedness and flexibility and narrowness thought. We often have a value or purpose and sort our thoughts for what will fit that value or purpose, right? The worry is when that value or purpose gets tied down to a particular measuring system that's out of our control and that is particularly inflexible or narrow. So yeah, so I think it's that something is seizing control, or we're giving up control of the purpose for which we're sorting our thoughts. And there's a background thing, and this is something that I'm unsure about, but I just want to float. I'm starting to suspect that it's easier to sort your thoughts in this way when you get very sharp quantified feedback about your success. Something like, when I say stuff trying to be funny and I have some vague sense of how people responded, I'm not, that doesn't Skinner box me just quite as much as when I get sharp points. And there's something, the worry is something like, the worry isn't that, oh, we shouldn't sort our thoughts for a purpose. It's that because certain purposes have been tied to the technology of points, that they are more assertive in Skinner boxing us. Does that make sense? Like, my worry is that those purposes will beat out in reformulating our thoughts against the ones for which there's no clear points.
Is like hearing somebody laugh count as a clear point? I mean, I'm like massively motivated by this.
Yeah.
In a way that like, actually, I'm sort of makes me wonder about what.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of the response is that I mean, again, it's not, the worry isn't that we shouldn't have targets and face, that we shouldn't have targets and reformulate our thoughts around them. The worry is that I might be dragged off of my interest in making people laugh or be empathetic because this one particular point is pulling me away from it. I mean, I sense that I'm not satisfying.
No. Yeah, no, this is like extremely helpful. Thanks. Yeah, I think that's awesome.
And Robin Jeshin has my last question in the queue. So unless anybody else raises their hand in the meantime, she'll be the last one.
Hi, thanks so much for a fascinating talk. I wanted to ask a question that's connected to, it may be connected to this distinction or apparent distinction between real life games and non-real life games. So I'm interested in the notion of game in the pickup artist lingo, incels, and all of that, right? So they're involved in game, right? The word that they choose is exactly apt. It fits with your notion. They can engage in it without being slavish to gamification metrics. They could just be enjoying the journey. So my question is, it seemed to me as if you were aligning value with game itself, whereas at least I think intuitively, a lot of us think game in the sense of the pickup artist is like, even while acknowledging that their exercise of creative agency may itself in the abstract be a good.
I mean, I'm so on board with you right now that I'm in the middle of co-authoring a paper about gamification and pickup artists.
Cool.
And I mean, Femi Taiwo and I are writing this thing about the connection between the language of body counts in the military and the language of scoring and pickup artists as like forms of gamification. So I think, I mean, the worry here is in games, full-on games, board games, role-playing games, it's okay to do this thing that I want to call the instrumental attitude of taking up a purpose and then using everything in the world to fulfill that purpose, precisely because it's secluded and cut off from other activities. So I think one of the first things I ever wrote in the game space, in the games philosophy of game space, was this argument that in games, real games are engines for turning competition into cooperation. And the reason they do it is they are engineered environments so that when they're well engineered, when people go into them and they fight against each other, they provide with each other the interesting struggle that they all wanted. So notice 2 reasons that's safe. 1, it's fully consensual, right? 2, the game was designed for when people struggle to make it interesting for everyone in the game. And pickup artists, they're designing games that are fun for only them, and then they're inflicting it on participants that didn't choose to be there, and the system hasn't designed to make it good for. So, I mean, I also think the same is true of like people playing, Enron executives playing games with competing for who can make the most money off of market manipulations. So I mean, the problem isn't the fact that they're creatively coming up with a rule set, it's that they're inflicting it in a case connected to the real world on people that didn't volunteer there without thinking about what that system is doing to the other people involved.
Okay, so I guess if I may just like raise a further question about that. So I agree with you that in cases in which there's no consent or there's a misunderstanding of what's going on, but it also seems as if you can have somebody kind of committed to game in the seduction sense, and they always avoid situations in which they think that the individual that they're trying to seduce is not, say, all in the know somehow. They're in some way they're maybe even playing along too or whatever, but I feel, at least for me, I'm still inclined to think that it's gross. And maybe that's just a kind of prudishness about, maybe that's not the right word. I think that's not the right word, but I don't know, a disconnect from another value system that they might have, because we do think that seduction in lots of other areas of life is okay, but somehow when it's made into like, I have this persona as a pickup artist, something seems misguided regardless of whether or not the objects are consensual or recognizing the manipulation.
Yeah, so one thing to say is when you play a game, you instrumentalize the various aspects of the game, like your goals you instrumentalize, your resources you instrumentalize, you're using them for pleasure. So if you have some view that there's some quality that's wrong to instrumentalize, then if you put it into a game, that's going to be wrong, right? You shouldn't play a game with that kind of thing. So if you think sexuality is the kind of thing that you shouldn't instrumentalize, then you would get that view. I myself think that if there were a bar where everyone who was going knew that they were playing the pickup artist game and knew the rules, whatever, people do what they want. That's
yeah.
And I think there are. I think I know bars like that and scenes like that, and I think there are worlds of Tinder, where people are actively involved in such a thing, and
right.
I don't
So
have
it's just so that's really helpful, just to think like, look, there are so many circumstances in which people are completely aware, and if you get your mind into that complete headspace. It's just like, it's fine.
I mean, here's the analogy really quick. Wouldn't it be weird if there was a space where people went and they fucking hit each other for fun and choked each other? Wouldn't that be weird? And that's boxing. I mean,
Yeah.
if it's not like, I mean, I've done martial arts. If it's not like people coerced in it to make money and put their bodies on the line, but if it's like, you know, what is a martial arts tournament? But
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
And we did get one more hand on this. This is our local USC philosopher of games, Dan Pallies.
Hey, thanks so much. That really interesting talk. And thanks for sticking around to take further questions. I wanted to try to get a little clearer in my own mind about what exactly the problem with gamification is. And here's the way that I'm thinking about it that's kind of puzzling me. So there's a kind of spectrum of step back ability, I guess, where there's some activities where we take on some kind of goal, but it's easy to, like when we're playing Terraforming Mars, I have no inclination to think that I just need to place more tiles in my everyday life. Like I can totally step away from this goal. Whereas other things, other more gamified things are less like that and it's harder to step away. But I guess I'm thinking that sometimes some games being more gamified and more on the end of being harder to step away can be a good thing, right? I don't want to be stepping back constantly. I don't want to be constantly reevaluating and trying to figure out what the right values and goals to have are, because then I wouldn't get anything done. So I kind of tried, maybe this is bad. It's made me self-conscious about it. I kind of try to gamify work. Like I'm stringent about keeping a spreadsheet of how much writing I'm doing or whatever. And I kind of like to think that it could be a good thing that it's at least to some degree inescapable, because I don't want to be constantly reevaluating. I want to be, well, I worry about weakness of will and stuff like that. So I'm wondering if the difficulty of stepping away itself is a bad thing, or if it's just contingent on what the goals are that it's difficult to step away from.
Yeah. That's super interesting. By the way, I now feel like the hardcore philosophy crew is hitting a public philosophy talk with the hard questions. So if any of you want to see the actual scholarly papers on this, I'll send them. But so the thought is something like, look, I completely respect the idea that we need heuristics and proxies, and we need to be locked into them, right? Some of the background stuff I really accept is that, like John Ulster stuff and Bratman stuff and all the stuff about how it's important to have a bright line and have principles. So the question is, so there's gonna be a trade-off, right? Like how long, the longer you go without reevaluating them, the more likely it is that they might come off from your goals. The more quickly you evaluate them, the less effective they'll be at binding you to something and being efficient. So what the right trade-off is going to vary from one case to another. The worry is that whatever the mix is of getting it right, that depends on a relationship of sometimes stepping back and comparing it to one's large-scale values. And I think the worry I have is basically when that never happens, or people are tempted tempted towards doing it less and less and less frequently, then you get the problem. There's another version of this that I've been thinking about that I don't have a good account of, and that version is something like, look, if somehow, and this, I don't know how this somehow goes, if somehow your formulation of your larger scale values gets captured, then that's going to undercut the ability to step back. But this requires like some way in which an articulation of a concept can slip in and take over how you think about that concept. And this is something I'm really trying to figure out right now, how this would go. But you might think that if you had that, like if instead of using a system for a while and you step back and you're like, oh my God, is this really working for me? You were just like, the place where things ended was citation rates. And that was right. Then something weird that's gonna prevent something. But that requires a whole theory about what it is have real values, what it is have value articulations, and how you can make mistakes between them that is literally scrawled over a whiteboard right off screen and is a mess.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really helpful. Thanks.
This has been fantastic. Thanks so much. I totally lied about this being a 90-minute session. We've gone a full 2 hours. And I'm going to clap loudly for all the people who are muted right now, because this has been a really fantastic session.
Thank you.
And I just going to claim extra points for us for arranging it for you, because it's been so great. So as long as I don't get in trouble for that.
Yeah, permission.
Okay. Thanks to everybody. Hope to see you soon in another event.